Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Power Law Investor. Today is October 3rd, 2024, a Thursday, and we'll be talking about Kaspa and the Power Law and what might be some caveats to think about, but why I also think the Power Law will hold even though it might bend. Again, this is not financial advice, it's only for informational purposes. So as I'm making this video, we can see that the price of Bitcoin is just below 61,000 and Kaspa is just above 14 and a half cents. And as a quick recap, we are talking about the power law for Kaspa, which essentially means that in the log space, you take the log on the x-axis, time since genesis, and the log on the y-axis, which is the price, and you end up with a straight line. You end up with a price line which has a very solid trend line that can be demonstrated by this r squared value and has a solid equation over there. And using this, we can make some predictions about the future. So if the future is like the past, we can expect a certain amount of potential results. And these results would be if the region something like this. We are now expecting almost 500+% over the next year. That's a 5x return. And over the next 6 months, if we return to this trend line, which is the orange line, we're expecting about 250+%, right? And one of the things that has been concerning of late has been this zone over here. Let's zoom into it a little bit over here. Typically, what has happened with Kaspa is that it has normally bounced from this purple line, but as we can see over these last few days, since maybe about the beginning of September, maybe the last month or so, that we've dipped below the line, then gone a little above it, and then dropped way below. And this is the minus 40% trend line. That means whatever our original trend line is, it's at subtracted 40% from there. And the green line is that we've subtracted 50% from there. And typically we've only hit the green line on wicks and then bounced off it. And as you can see right now, we're getting quite close to it. It's not really clear because of the arrow, but the price for us is 0.143 based on this update. And the price is updated once a day on my algorithm. But the minus 50% line is 0.1406, right? So call it almost 14 cents or so. So it's getting pretty close to that time point or to that price point. And the question we want to ask ourselves is, do we think that it's a good time to continue investing? The strategy for this channel is that we do a daily DCA invest and we have limit orders placed along the bottom around this minus 50% like I have over here. So for half the cash that we have, roughly about $440 at this point, and that order I placed just yesterday, it hasn't hit those limit orders as yet, but you can see I'm also below the trend line, below the minus 50% trend line also. So I have these two limit orders just at the minus 50% trend line and 1 cent below, right? And I wanted to discuss today some of the logic here and why we might be getting worried and discuss some of the pros and cons for the approach that we're taking. And the factor that if you want to worry about things, and of course people only worry about things when the price goes down. When the price is up, everyone's worried about the greed factor, right? Like, oh, do I have enough Kaspa? But when the price goes down, it's sort of, oh my God, is my money safe? Am I going to lose the money? Do I get out? When do I buy more? For someone like myself, it's sort of like, do I buy now or do I wait until the price drops even more, right? And so there's no real way to answer the question. I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did, but we do have the power law, which gives us a really good mathematical estimate of what has happened in the past and were the future to be similar to the past, what you can expect from the future, right? So let's talk a little bit about this equation here. This equation that we generated for the trend line, the y is equal to 4x minus 12.63. It's the 4x value that has been dropping over time, right? So what's happening is this is a dynamically updating system, right? So the more time it spends below the trend line, the more it pulls this equation down, and the 4 point, I think it was 4.09 a month and a half ago. Now it's dropped down all the way to 4, right? So that's roughly about a 2% drop or so in the value. And so the trend line is bending down and the equation is also changing, right? Because the more time we spend below the trend line, like we did over here, the more it starts pulling this trend line down, right? So I hope that is clear. And the first question we want to ask is this something that we want to particularly worry about? Why is this happening? Why isn't it being bent down? Is this normal? Have we seen this happen in the past? And the other question we want to ask is why might this be happening, right? So two sort of parts here. So let's answer the first question first, which is how has this value changed over time? So this is a graph that I generated which looks at the slope and intercept. The slope is this value over here, the 4.0, and the intercept is this minus 12.63, and how that changes over time, right? And so the data starts roughly around middle of 2022, but as you can see, there's a lot of fluctuation in the beginning and the price is moving up and down. We don't have a lot of data, but then it sort of stabilizes over time. And so a few months ago, let's say in June, we were looking, sorry, this is the intercept. We're looking at the slope over here. The slope is in blue as it says in this graph over here. In June, we were looking at a slope of about 4.16, right? And today, if we look at it, it's all the way down to about 4, right? So we're seeing that drop over time. And so is this a significant drop? Is this unusual? Is something happening that has not happened in the past? And we can see that if we look at what's happened historically, right, we've seen sort of this thing coming down over time quite a bit. So in one sense, you could say, all right, it's continuing down. Maybe it's going to continue to go down. But rather than try and answer it just from looking at this data, it really makes more sense to me to see what happened with Bitcoin in some of its earlier days, right? And so here is exactly that same graph that we do for Bitcoin. And the time frame here for Bitcoin is much bigger, right? So for Bitcoin, we're looking all the way from about 2010 to 2024, whereas for Kaspa, we're just looking at 22 to 24, a little over 2 years, right? So keeping that into account, let's say we're looking at the first 3 or 4 years after Bitcoin launched. And so if we're starting here in 2010, looking around 2014 or so, we had a slope of we had a slope that was in the graphs, I think, yeah, so it's the red and the blue positioning is different, but just focus on the color. So in about September 2014, you had a slope of about 7.02, but over time that came down, that came down 7.02 all the way came down to 5.7 and then kept on changing again and again. So about 4 years after launch, we went down all the way from 6.94 to today, what the final value is 5.71. Okay, so that's maybe a drop of maybe 20%, I think, more or less. Yeah. So yeah, from about 7 all the way down to about 5.6. Yeah, that gives you about a 20% drop, right? So we had this drop and we saw the slope change quite a bit, right? Even over the course of just a few months, it went from 7.02 to 6.5, right? So maybe that's a drop of about 8-9%. So now if we look at what was happening with Bitcoin in its early stages, when it had about the same number of data points as Kaspa, we can see that this change that we've seen in the slope is not really that terrible, right? So from about March, 4.25 to about now, we're looking at maybe about 5% or so, 6%. So compared to some of the changes that we saw in Bitcoin in its early days, this is roughly par for the course, right? And the R squared value keeps on improving, right? It's still at 0.95. So what's happening is that we're getting some initial data, we're getting some more data in, and eventually over time, if the power law continues to hold, then we're going to see a stabilization. So for me, this is something that we can use the analogy or doing the comparison with what Bitcoin did was saying, okay, Bitcoin had this much variation in the slope, maybe 5, 6, 7, 10%. What we're seeing in Kaspa is a 10% adjustment also. Maybe that's not such a big deal. Now, if I were to do this analysis very rigorously, you take all the different time points, because I could be cherry picking like, oh, I'm just looking at this particular example, right? But I want to give you guys an idea, right? That all the way from Kaspa, it all the way went from 6.51 to 4 now, whereas with Bitcoin, it went all the way from, at its high point to 12 all the way down to 5, right? So it's not an exact comparison. I'm sure there are better quantitative ways to do about it, but just looking at this variation isn't enough to think, oh my God, something unusual is happening here that hasn't happened before, right? And you guys can ask questions in the comments and I'll try and respond to those as much as possible. The other thing that I also want to talk about though is why is this deviation sort of happening, right? And I want to talk a little bit about the correlation between the Bitcoin and Casper prices. Now, anyone who's looked at the altcoin market will realize that Bitcoin is still king, right? So whatever's happening in Bitcoin is going to influence the alt market also. And they aren't completely in sync, but they are rhyming. Generally, when Bitcoin goes up, the alt market will also follow. When Bitcoin goes down, the alt market will also follow. So what I wanted to give you guys an idea is when Bitcoin was following its power law, there was really nothing else that it was that was in the market, right? Maybe Ethereum and some of those other alts came in at a later time point, but for a long period of time, Bitcoin was the only crypto game in town, so it was operating independently. Now, when we take this power law for Kaspa over here, it is a combination of the intrinsic power law that Kaspa is following and what is happening in the Bitcoin space too. So we have this other variable over here. And in order to try and understand this a little bit, I created this graph. Now, this is just a simple graph showing the Bitcoin price on the left axis and the Casper price on the y-axis. And this is looking from July 22 to currently. And you can just visually see that there is a correlation of some sort going on, right? And when we look at this by taking a 90-day rolling correlation, so that's taking a 90-day chunks at a time, seeing how those pairs of values are correlated, then taking another 90-day chunk and another 90-day chunk and moving on, we end up with a graph that looks like this, right? And now it would be great if we only got one value out of it, but we're seeing through this that Caspa and Bitcoin are correlated, right? But not at the same value all the time. It sort of changes. Sometimes it dips negative, but for most of it, it's positive. And you can see that the average line over here, if you're taking the average of this entire graph, is about 0.24, right? So a quarter correlation. But sometimes, like right now, you're looking at a value of 0.76, right? Or in September, or right now, let's call it 0.772. So about 72% of the values are correlated. So whatever is going on in Bitcoin is going to affect Kaspa also. So really the model we want to think about is not that Kaspa is operating independently with this power law, but this is a combination power law of what's happening in Kaspa, the intrinsic power law here, which is probably due to adoption and miner production, etc., and what's happening in Bitcoin over here with its power law over here, right? And so the metrics that we've been using, sort of this minus 40% and these minus 50%, we only have about 856 data points for this. So they might still be influenced quite dramatically by what's happening with Bitcoin, right? So again, for this correlation, if Bitcoin suddenly has a huge drop, we're going to see a big drop in Kaspa also. And if that happens, we might easily break through this minus 50% trend line that we've been talking about that we bounced out of. Now I don't know that for sure, but this is actually a good thing, right? Because we know that despite all the correlations and everything else, right, in this graph, over time, we are still seeing this power law for Kaspa, right? And what that means is that maybe we have more fluctuations in the short term, but in the longer term, we expect to be coming back to the trend line. Maybe the trend line adjusts a little this way and that. And the interesting thing is, let's say that this correlation holds, and if and when Bitcoin takes off, you can expect Kaspa also to take off at the same time. And that's sort of the big point that I want us to get across, is that we are going to have short-term fluctuations. This is par for the course. We expect some of this. Does the minus 50% line that we like as a good buying point hold? It's still probably a pretty good point, but we may dip below that also. Maybe we go up to minus 60%. But as Bitcoin takes off because of this correlation, assuming that correlation holds, maybe it bounces around, maybe it doesn't, then there's a very good chance that we also accelerate upwards with Bitcoin. So the long story short is whatever is going to happen in Bitcoin is going to affect Kaspa. Don't think of it operating independently of what's going on with Bitcoin. This function that we see, this curve for Kaspa, it looks very pure, but it is a combination of what's happening with Kaspa and what is happening in Bitcoin. So those are merged together in a complicated way that I'm not smart enough to figure out as yet. But what I did want to explain to you guys is that we do have this the change in slope, of course, but we also have this correlation taking place, right? And so in the short term, if Bitcoin drops down, currently it's at 60,000 or 60,500, it could easily drop down to the 50s. I don't know what'll do. It when even drop down into the 40s. No one wants to think about that, but it could happen. And if that happens, Caspa is also going to be dragged down. But over time, over a long enough time horizon, we should be able to reestablish this power law and experience these extraordinary returns that we're looking at, north of 500%. So for now, with the Power Law Investor, we will continue making those investments on a day-to-day basis. The best available data that we have is that the minus 50% trend line holds. So I've got some limit orders placed around them with the cash, the 20% cash that we've been holding. And that's the best that we can do right now. Yet there's no reason to worry if we do crash below this trend line. We might drop down to minus 60%. That's fine. I look at it more as a buying opportunity. And again, given the correlation that we have with Bitcoin, what's going to affect us on the downside also is going to affect us on the upside. And that is where I think we're going to have the extraordinary returns from Kaspa. So just wanted to make this video to get some thoughts across. If there's something that you'd like to clarify or some questions that you'd like to ask me, please comment down below and like and subscribe. Cheers.